Hi, I'm Ankhra. I'm the president and founder of PS314, and welcome to our summer series of 2020 Fireside Chats on identity. This is actually one of our last for the summer, and what we've decided to do is focus on conversations of lived experiences or just around our identities, which are multidimensional and multifaceted. We're finding so much conflict in the world, and we thought this would be a good opportunity just to explore each other's lives and understand each other a little bit better. Today's conversation is focused on gender solidarity. We really want to explore it through the lens of race and where the differences lie, the disconnects potentially, and the areas of alignment that we can all kind of come together and better understand each other. So I'm so honored to welcome two good friends, Jaime Rosegren and Nadja Payne, to the conversation.
Hi,
Nadja.
guys.
Hi, Jaime.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to have you both. And of course, just so everyone knows, Naja and I went to college together. So we've known each other for a really long time. Part of the, for the company, we've wanted to do these conversations around identity, but I have to really give you credit, Naja, because I've just, social media is kind of like the other world that we live in and sometimes our first world. So I was looking at your Facebook post at the beginning of the summer, and you're just so clear about your position in the world, and your voice is just really just so profound to me specifically. So I'm always really curious about your take on things. And you had made a post in the beginning of the summer around gender and race. And so maybe what we can do is just start with you all both introducing yourselves. But Naja, what I'd love for you to do is talk a little bit about that Facebook post and why you felt it was so important to post it and what you learned from it. And then also, Jaime, what you learned.
So my name is Jaime Rosegren. I am a film worker and small business owner in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm very, very honored to be a part of this conversation.
I'm Nadja Payne. I live in Atlanta. We both actually, Jaime and I both live in Atlanta. I'm a New York native. And I basically, the way the post came about is I have a 14-year-old daughter. She's very precocious. My boyfriend, we're having a conversation. We talk a lot about race and gender, and we're having a conversation on white versus black and just the way girls are. And then the conversation evolved from girls to women and understanding how they are basically when they're little, and then how they evolve into the women that we work with and walk alongside. And we started to get into some of the tropes and stereotypes that we understood to be true, my daughter and I, as Black girls and women. And my boyfriend was like, I don't think that's true. And then I realized that I was having this conversation in a vacuum, because you have three Black people discussing what we think to be true about a completely different race and how they view their gender. So I just put the question out there on Facebook, because I have friends like Jaime and others who are allies, and we have very open, honest, brutal conversations with each other about race and gender. And I was hoping that they, in that safe space, and I actually said it was a safe space in the post, which meant that no one else could come in and attack someone else's views, would be able to shed some light. And little did I know, I think 90 responses later, it became a very big conversation on gender tropes among racial lines, and then even geographical lines, as we started to discuss not only what white women and Black women, how they differ and what they were raised to believe about themselves and where they fit in the world, but then also how we fit in the world based on where we grew up, South versus the North, poor versus rich. And that was even more of a fractured space. So it was definitely eye-opening.
It was really interesting. As I've mentioned to you guys before, like I was kind of caught in the middle of some of those tropes, but not like fully in one side or the other. And that's because I was raised in the South, but my mom raised me, and her family are Northerners. And so I had a mix of those two different styles coming at me as I was growing up. And so it was really interesting to see kind of the things that I had been taught and like how they relate to other Southern white women, and other Northern white women.
Okay, so let's be more specific. I'm really curious. What have you found to be false stereotypes about white women or true?
I'm going to start with the Karen.
Okay.
Because that's the biggest one, but it is a trope about white women that is enforced and reinforced in them to start as demure, to start as subservient, to their male counterparts. And then from that point, if they can't get what they want, to use those men to get what they want. And a lot of white women don't realize that these behaviors have been kind of ingrained in our brains until you start to assert yourself and other people call you out for it, and call you names and kind of try to denigrate you back to your place.
So is this a way for, and I know it's difficult to speak on behalf of the entirety of the race and gender, right? I don't think that that's anyone's responsibility, but just from your observations and then also your own personal experience, Jaime, would you say that as a white woman, were you nurtured and cultivated to believe that that was kind of a role for you that we see many white women kind of taking on today in this like specific space of the character of Karen, right? It's basically consistently, there's a passive aggressiveness to the behavior. And also like almost an entitlement to an agency over all of the space and feeling as though our presence as Black people is encroaching upon that. And so that's what I'm seeing, right? And so I'm just curious, from your experience, has that been something that you find you were raised to believe?
I had to fight against the kind of Southern genteel, you sit and you wear a dress and you look pretty and you listen and you nod your head and you clean and you cook and you take care of. But then my mom and her family were like, no, forget about that. You don't have to do any of that. But there was this, like I've mentioned before, my grandmother on my mom's side would always say, suffer in silence. So it was like this whole thing where, yes, we had, things in our lives that were hard and frustrating, but you didn't talk about it to people. You just dealt with it internally. So it goes back to the seen, not heard thing that is pushed in more like Southern culture to me. It's just reinforced in a different way. But yeah, yes, you can have a job and yes, you can have a career as a white woman, but you also need to have a family.
What is I'd love to go back a little bit just in terms of how you were both raised. And I think of it from the perspective of fight or flight.
So I grew up in the Bronx. My neighborhood was working class when I grew up. Lower middle class, working class would be the best way to describe it. And my mom is West Indian. So there was a little bit of a disconnect. My neighborhood was wildly West Indian, but it was also Irish and Italian. When I was younger, it filtered out Irish and Italian as I got older by the time I got to high school. But my point is that there was a certain level of rough and tumble in my neighborhood that you just had to kind of adhere to. I was really taught for self-preservation, survival, which is something I know, Pi, you and I in different other conversations have talked about how survival mode still follows me at 45 years old. I'm successful, and I still kind of, that fear of not being able to survive is what drives a lot of my movements to this day. So, here I am 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 up through high school, survival, autonomy, having no safety net, socioeconomically, my mom made she made no money. So I learned how to fight physically, mentally, and emotionally. I learned how to fight. I always had to protect myself physically. It wasn't uncommon for fights to break out after school or to get threatened to get jumped or whatever the case may be. Emotionally, I learned how to guard my feelings. And then mentally, it made me, harder and stronger. But what it also does is it also put me on the defensive. So if it even smells like I am being taken advantage of, or it even smells like someone is out to harm me or mine in any way, shape, or form, real or perceived, mentally, I wind up going into what I call that pit bull demeanor. I'm not the first person to throw a punch, but you're going to look like you walked away from a fight. Kind of those things. I grew up poor, middle class, working class. I had a very tough mom. She and I did not get along through most of my teenage years. We fought a lot physically. And I ultimately was basically taught that I am, if not me, then no one. And now I'm grown and I've graduated from school and I've got degrees and I've got kids and I'm in a workplace setting, and the angry, aggressive Black woman trope is born. Right?
Because you're fighting for your existence. You're fighting just to have a space. And so what does that mean in terms of vulnerability? I mean, does that even exist for you, or is that something that you've had to grow into?
Oh, after a couple of years of therapy and some failed relationships, I learned vulnerability. I learned vulnerability did not equate weakness. I've had to learn, and I probably was in my 40s before I learned how to really vocalize it in a way where I could be vulnerable, but also still hold on to my power without feeling that one cannibalized the other.
And so, and Jaime, how about you? Just in terms, you talked a little bit about the way in which you were raised. When you first started to connect with identity, was it through the lens of gender? Was it through the lens of race, socioeconomic, or was it a combination of a few of those?
It was gender first. My mom was never, she never talked about things politically, but she would talk about things as they related to women's issues. But we didn't have conversations about race, and we didn't have conversations about, well, yes, you experience this as a white woman, but Black women experience it 10 times worse, or, you know, and I think that my mom she didn't take the time to think about it, much less talk to me about it. And I didn't start thinking about that stuff until well after college.
Was there a particular situation that took place that introduced you to race?
No, but like I said, I work in the film industry, and when I started working in the industry, and New York is, a very diverse place, but the film industry up there was still very white. And so I would just look around me and go, well, and, there were people of color in my departments who either were new into it. There were a very few who had been there for 10 or 15 years. And I would just hear stories about how, like, when they were the only person of color out of years and years of working. And so I think that's when I started to think about it. I went to college late, so I was probably late 20s, early 30s when I started to kind of see, not necessarily understand the intersection of it, but kind of see the intersection of gender and race.
So, and you've talked a little bit about, and I'd love to hear a bit, just in terms of your advocacy for others. Are you looking to ensure that no one is the only one in the room? Are you hoping to bring in more women, more people of color? I mean, where do you stand as it relates to diversification in your field?
For a long time, I didn't think that I could speak up about it because I was newer in the industry. I've been in the industry over a decade now, and I know my strength. I know my skill, and I have absolutely no problem demanding that the table be more equal. And, I do it. I try to do it in a way that it's not, hey, this is a person of color, maybe we should bring them in. So it's not just a room of white people. It's more about, hey, this guy's really good at electronics, and he can rig any light that you want to. I've used the tropes that we've kind of talked about, being demure, deferring to the men in the room. Like I've learned to use those as a way to strengthen my position. So
look at you using your white woman superpowers for good.
I know.
It's interesting. Visually, it feels like you're navigating like very nuanced spaces and ensuring that you're not coming up against specific blocks. And it sounds as though that skill set was learned, right? It was something that you were taught as you were younger. And I've also heard this statement, I'm curious to hear what you both say, but Naja, I want to give you the floor to talk about your experience at work, that America loves Black women's labor, but are not invested in Black women's politics.
Mm-hmm. So, in my 20s and early 30s, I always like to say I'd never been fired from a job, But I wasn't asked back either, right? You know, I was a little, fiery and hell and brimstone. And when I felt that things were not right or okay from a cultural standpoint, racial standpoint, whatever, I was very quick to call it out. I started working in entertainment media, was the beginning of my career. So I worked for a lot of major Black publications, but as I moved on, I worked for television networks where there may be 2 Black people in a team of 10 or 12. And, as they're starting to promote things to a different demographic, i.e. our demographic, or they're coming up with content that has much more of a cultural slant, I'm in the room and I'm loudly stomping my feet and shaking my fist, being like, you can't do this. Or if you're going to do this, you need to do this way, that way, and this way. When you call someone a racist, their defense mechanisms automatically go up. So now I still am very straightforward. I really do believe in being straightforward in conversations like that, but I am also open to a conversation versus me just kind of throwing out accusations. But what it became more important for me to do was to really talk to the team of women I was leading, who were also in technology. Don't IM me in a meeting and say, what do you think about this? Or come to me after the meeting and say, hey, I have this idea. Speak it in the meeting. Say it. You know what I mean? And I'll advocate for you in that space. It was almost a 50-50. So as opposed to, pushing all of my feminine superpowers onto the male and having them kind of recoil, it was, okay, I'm a woman, you're a woman. There's a certain level of gender solidarity here, and I got your back.
It sounds like you're using your special skills as well, Naja, right? Like you both have this survival experience from your childhood. I'm wondering though, just in terms of you both met at the Women's March, and there were so many dynamics that kind of flew around politically, just in terms of there was solidarity and then there is not. Do you feel that there's a lack of trust between Black women and white women, and if so, why?
So I think there's a lack of trust on one end and a level of hubris on the other. So the lack of trust really lies with Black women, because I think, white women, again, and I am talking in a collective, there's a certain level of individuality in which they are brought up with to understand, but when they need numbers, they typically will hold out their hand to us, right? So the Women's March is a prime example. Jaime and I were on teams and headed teams in order to galvanize Georgia and the women in Georgia to get up to DC. And we did it, and it was a great job, and we had an amazing time. But I cannot begin to tell you how many conversations I was on where white women were talking about, well, we need more women. So it was like, where are the Black women, and where are the lesbians, and where are the trans women? But you're not thinking of these women any other time. You're thinking of them because you want the numbers, and you're also not representing them when you talk about the Women's March and what we need to do and what we're fighting for. Our interests aren't even bubbling to the top, but you don't want to be the lone person standing outside with your one picket sign. You want 15 others, and you don't care what they look like or what they're going through, because the numbers is what matters to you, not the experience. So there was a lot of infighting to some degree, not necessarily on our team, but in larger teams, and even on a national level, to be honest with you, in terms of being able to get the other women besides, cis white women to participate in a way that they felt that they weren't being used as props. And I think the hubris is literally on the white women's side. When they don't need us, and even I will even pull into some degree, like I watched the DNC. I thought it was great. It happened to happen on the day, the 100-year of the celebration of Susan B. Anthony and suffrage. And all they kept talking about was the day that women got the right to vote.
Which women?
Right. It's literally that level of hubris. It's, white women up there like, we won the right to vote. No, you did not. You're not thinking of us. But if we had to march right now because our votes were being suppressed, white women would be looking at us, pulling out their hands saying, hey, come join us. Your right to vote is being threatened.
I mean, everything that Nadja said was on point, and it's something that we as white women need to actively fix. Like, we need to be active in the correction of it. And a lot of white women don't see that and don't understand it. And it's a lot of conversations that I've had to say, okay, but if you want them to show up for you for this thing, then you need to be there for that thing. And you need to understand that it's like we were talking on your post, Nadja, the other day. Like when I explain to white people what BLM means, white people are here. Everyone else is here. They just want to be here. Like they just want to be on the same level. They don't want more. They don't want to be higher. Black people and people of color just want to be on the same fucking level. And white women are raised on a me first mentality. You know, the saying, it takes a village. Mm-hmm. Like that's not a part of our vocabulary growing up, like in our psyche. I very much had to learn it here, and the village that I have here is amazing, and I love them, and I would never trade them for anything in the world. But understanding that it is not me first. It is not about what I want. It's about what the person who is marginalized the most wants. Fighting for that also helps fight for me and brings equality to me. And it's like, you have to try and explain that. It's very difficult, but there's very much a expectation from white women that Black women will just be there because their labor has laid the groundwork for everything that we have. It's something that is taken for granted.
Jaime, you sound so evolved in your understanding and there's the insight. And I'm curious, how did you get to this place? Where did this understanding come from?
It came from having people like Naja in my life who talked to me and made me sit in my uncomfortableness and made me realize that what I thought about things and how I thought about things was not helpful, but harmful. And I still get it wrong. Like I want to make that absolutely clear. A lot of conversations, just talking to people, Black women, talking to Hispanic women, talking to Native women. There's a lot that happens on social media. There's a lot of little cultural conversations and like small personal conversations. And I just read.
It's almost easier to have big conversations on platforms with people you don't know very well. But those hard conversations, it's interesting to see the ripple effects of the racial uprising of 2020 and many friends and family members and colleagues, and some who are of color and some who are not. Everyone knows who they have to talk to. What does that feel like? Have you both been in rooms and in relationship with people where those hard conversations have been presented to you and no judgment? Have you been able to navigate them or have you chosen to walk away and not take on the labor?
You know, I got to be honest with you, 2020 is a hell of a year, right? Whereas in the past, I would run head first into any conversation around race and gender and not think twice about it. This year, if anything positive, and I use the word positive loosely, has come out of it. There's a level of exhaustion that exists where you have to kind of pick your battles, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like between fighting for race, gender, and just getting people to wear a damn mask, you know, at some point, it really does become, which fight do I want to pick today? Because even, you know, and I will say this, even the COVID conversation has now been drawn along party and racial lines.
My conversations with people are more work friends. It's a weird dynamic that I have to navigate because these people will also help or hinder me getting hired. A conversation I just had, and she and I, like, I know that we're on opposite ends of the spectrum, and we always try and have at least a respectful dialogue back and forth. But she started talking about BLM, and she started talking about all the anger in the world, started talking about how, you know, in Martin Luther King, they had their nice Sunday best on and they had their pamphlets with information and they were very respectful and blah, blah, blah. And I said to her, and how long has it been since that time? And how much has changed? You have to understand that the core injustices that he was fighting still exist. Can you not understand how people, especially Black people, would still be angry, if not angrier? So we had a little bit more back and forth, And she started talking about her grandfather, who was an immigrant and came to this country with nothing, as if slaves and immigrants were the same thing. I was so baffled in the moment. So I have definitely had conversations where I'm just like, I can only press it so far. And anyone who knows me knows that I do not keep my mouth shut. That was one of those conversations where I didn't know what to say to her because I was so baffled by that viewpoint.
Now, in 2020 in particular, so much has become is being revealed about people's true belief systems and what equality means, or whether it's valued or not, and really just, I think also the definition of it, right? Because as you mentioned, as we talked a little bit about, there's certainly a women's movement for equality and equity in the country, and there's a fight for that. And then if we reference, well, we're celebrating the time where we were allowed to vote, but not taking into consideration that there have been levels to it. Also feels as though there's a lack of understanding that it requires everyone's history for us to move into a powerful future. And so it's very clear that you both understand that, but it also feels as though there's a lot of gray area to Naja, right? Like there's some people who are very clearly racist, and then there's a gray area of individuals, and whether that is a conscious decision or unconscious decision to acknowledge everyone, that seems to be happening right now. There's a lot of conversation around. We see very clearly, just if we think about police brutality, you see public assassinations on social media, and the victims are Black people. And there is a narrative, a national narrative around that is justifying some of these assaults as, well, these are criminals or there's a background. And then we've just seen literally assassinations by a white man, and the narrative is not the same. Right. And so what's your reaction to just knowing that exists currently, that we have two different views? How do we merge this into one reality? Because it feels as though we're living in two separate realities.
I agree. And, you know, I remember talking to my daughter about this year and going back to that. And I was like, you know, and my momism, I guess I kind of lost her. But I was like, you know, this year's kind of like a croissant. Like there are a couple of very thin layers, but if you lay them on top of each other, right, it becomes a really thick piece of crusty bread, right? So you've got you've already got the politics of who's in office today, right? And then let's say that's about 3 or 4 layers, because there's layers to him. And then you've got the pandemic, right? And then you've got BLM. And then you've got the shootings. Those are more layers. And then you've got, you know, anything else that comes across in 2020 that on any other given year would be considered like an anomaly, but it gets sucked up in the black hole that is 2020, right? The asteroid that's going to hit us for election day, the hurricane category 5, like all these things would literally be the biggest news stories of the year. But because there's been so much going on this year, they're just like another small layer, but they get on you. I say, and then you have the recession. I'm sorry, that was the other one. But we really, as a country, haven't really felt yet. I mean, some people are definitely feeling it more than others, but there's kind of been a bubble around us. I really do believe that money and wealth is a great equalizer, and not when you have it, it's when you don't. Your question was, how can we kind of come together? I wish I could give you the MLK conversation around, we just need to sit down and talk, and there needs to be more understanding. No, if we stick to the conversation around gender and gender solidarity, when this recession when the effects of this recession is actually really start to be felt, there will be less women in the workplace than there probably has been since women went to work when men went to war, because of the childcare crisis and people working from home. And a lot of articles across the spectrum from all sorts of, from conservative to liberal papers, have talked about how there were more women in the workplace leading up to 2020 than ever before after the recession, right? Because 2 people needed to work, but women were making strides in business and industry, and now women are falling out by large numbers. So this kind of goes back to, you know, if you bring the conversation full circle, we're needed in numbers, right? So you can have your ideas, you can have your you could believe your tropes, your stereotypes, and your ideologies hidden or real. But at some point, there's going to be a reckoning when people realize that women in large numbers are no longer part of the workforce. And it really doesn't become a black or white thing. It becomes a woman thing.
Jaime, do you agree that's going to be the unifying force for women?
I do. I agree with that. I also feel the effects of all of this in a different way because although I don't have children, my industry has been shut down for 6 months. We do not at all have the full effects.
Well, I mean, I think we certainly talk about it whenever we're working in the social justice space, which is a majority of our clients here at the company at PS314. Oftentimes it's not a reality until it's your personal reality. And so we can create greater awareness of these issues and help to just kind of like juxtapose it a bit and say, well, if this were you, how would you feel? Right. And after a while, you start to feel that pain point a little bit more. What I'm hearing from you both is there's certainly hope for that future that we can all get around one cause and for that supports everyone. But it should not require maybe Black women's labor to make that happen at this point because of the exhaustion. And then maybe part of the process for us to move forward is to equalize the labor, right? That instead of using your voice to ignite Naja, it's your voice to ignite Jaime, and maybe it's time for you to nuance Naja. And I'm speaking from the perspective of what you represent, right? If we're acknowledging the fact that it has been unequal in terms of the fight and the labor that's been required. And so now, can spread it out a bit. We start to look forward. I'd love to look back for a second and just tell me, just knowing what you know now, what would you say to your 12-year-old self? What advice would you give about the world?
I didn't even have a voice at 12. Like, I wish that I had had a voice. I wish that I had felt comfortable in my own skin enough to be like, no, that's stupid. Or no, that's racist. Or no, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to. I mean, I think that for me would have been the biggest thing is just like, be yourself. Like, love the things that you love, no matter how silly or stupid or like weird they may be. And just speak yourself. Like, just tell people who you are and find your people.
If I go back to my 12-year-old self, I think I would really tell myself that people will judge you for the way that you look and be surprised by the things that you stand for and the way that you act, because they don't always coincide. And I say that to say, we talked about this offline. As a light-skinned Black woman growing up, colorism was also a huge part of my upbringing, and not being Black enough in certain spaces. And I learned to insert myself in certain spaces, and that it probably wasn't a good idea for me to insert myself in others. So I always get teased. So at one point, maybe from like 12 to middle 20s, maybe, I tried to shrink myself to be a smaller person in the room. And then I overcompensated in my early 20s into 30s to be the biggest person in the room, right? The biggest, baddest person in the room. And now that I'm in my 40s, I think I found my balance. And I guess the short answer is that at 12, you are enough. Whoever you choose to be, whatever you choose to present, you are enough. You don't have to overcompensate for something that people tell you you're not enough of. Nor do you have to shrink yourself because you feel that you're too much of something else. And that you will, to Jaime's point, find the tribe that loves you for all of that. Like, you said that you the voyeurism on my page, you love my voice. That voice would not have been if I had kept with I don't have a right to speak on these issues.
Right.
The posts like the one that brought this conversation to light and some of my other ones would have never been if I had stuck to that mantra, because that's what I was told from, the time I was in middle school all the way up actually through college. And then after that, I was like, I'm going to be a Asada Shakur. And I went that route, and that didn't always work for me either. So now here I am.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like finding your voice and just giving yourself permission to be yourself. And honor
and to make
exactly
the mistakes
who you
along
are.
the way.
I have a word association for you, and hopefully this will give us a little bit of a peek into where we're going as a country, and maybe even as a gender group. Can you give me 3 words that associate with the past, your past, our current present from your perspective, and then what you see in terms of our future? Jaime, why don't you start?
So for my past, I would say unstable, hidden, and insecure. For my present, still unstable, because this has been a rough year, and I would say painful. I don't know. I'm usually like the cheeriest, happiest person in the room, but I really don't feel a lot of hope. I want to, because I know there are some beautiful people doing hard things, but I don't. It feels very hopeless and hard.
I'm not going to be a ray of sunshine either. I had to write mine down so I could remember it.
Okay.
No, I mean, if I had to say 3 words from my past, I would say volatile. I would also say exploitative. I think people recognized a strength in me that I didn't recognize in myself in multiple avenues. So in the inability to harness that power, I allowed other people to use it. And then I would say angry. Anger was a warm blanket for me as a kid growing up. And then in my present, it's almost come full circle, anger still. And then I would say tired, not sleepy tired, but just, tiredness that leads to a certain level of numbness, apathy almost, that I don't feel I should have. And then I think the last word would be, and I don't even know if this is a word, is it unempowered or disempowered? Disempowered comes to mind. Just lack of control. There's so many things that are going on. People, the conversation around it is always, control what you can. I don't feel like there's anything that I can control. But for the future, and I think this is what, regardless of what my past is and where I presently am, this is actually, I've always been a person who has a hard time staying in the present. That has always been an issue for me. But I think in this particular case, it might work. Because when I think of the future, the 3 words that come to me are like strong, determined, and motivated. This cannot last.